As I noted, my name's Malcolm. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're new, we have a co-pastor model. So me and Slim are the pastors, and we switch off preaching every week. I like to call us the sword and the shield, or the bomb and the balm. I'll let you decide which one is which. So for the last 8 months, we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount. And it's Jesus' first set of formal teachings in the book of Matthew. And in these chapters, we see essentially the outline of what the Christian ethic looks like. We see the picture of the Christian in the Beatitudes, someone who lives in solidarity with the poor, someone who mourns, someone who hungers and thirsts after righteousness, someone who's merciful, pure in heart, a peacemaker, someone who's persecuted for the sake of righteousness. We get specific ethical commands against murder, against anger, against divorce, against revenge, I would argue against all kinds of violence. But that's just chapter 5. In chapter 6, we're reminded of 3 practices that are essential to the Christian life: giving to the poor, fasting, and prayer. And each of these disciplines actively shape us into Christ-likeness. And then Jesus moves into this extended discourse about greed and the worry that constantly crouches at our doors, the worry that results from mammon worship, where mammon is money or riches. This is our last few weeks framing what Jesus sets up as a battle between gods for your souls and for your priorities, a battle between the God of the Scriptures and mammon. But then chapter 7 hits. And if you listen closely, you'll notice that there are no really specific ethical commands in chapter 7, because this is how Jesus closes a sermon. I read the whole chapter this morning so that we could hear in a pretty self-contained way what it is that Jesus wants us to come away from this sermon with. And chapter 7, verses 1 and 2 pretty significantly sum up the attitude that we ought to have when we come away from the Sermon on the Mount. I'll read it again, verses 1 and 2. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So in what way is this an attitude and an action? Well, allow me to use an example. I'm going to give you all an opportunity to judge me. Many of you know nothing about my musical tastes. So this is a fun question. So Spotify every year does this Unwrapped thing where they pick kind of your most listened to genres. So I want you as a congregation to vote which of the following 5 has not been in my top 5 over the course of the last few years. So I'm going to give you 5 genres, and you have to guess basically which one doesn't belong. Or, if you think they all fit, which would be weird, you can choose the none of the above option. Okay. First option: smooth saxophone jazz. Second option: electro house music. Third option is otacore. If you don't know what otacore is, it's music that's based on anime or manga or Japanese video games. Fourth option: gospel music. And the fifth option is djent. If you don't know what djent is, it's progressive metal music. Or none of the above. So who thinks that smooth jazz is not on my top 5? Raise your hand. Okay? Who thinks that electro house music is not in my top 5? Okay? Who thinks that otacore is not in my top 5? Well, y'all think that is so interesting. Okay. How many of you think that gospel music is not in my top 5? Okay? How many of you think that djent or progressive metal is not in my top 5? And how many of you think that this was all just a ruse and these are all 5 on my top 5? Well, guess what? They're all on my top 5. Actually, progressive metal actually shows up as number 1 every single year. So you learned something. Now, in asking you to answer that question, I'm asking you to make a split-second judgment. Very few of you have any amount of data about my musical taste, so you're forced to make a judgment based on the data that you have available to you. And all that data is what the genres are, and perhaps the kinds of people that you think listen to those kinds of music. But here's the issue. Your data was limited, and so it led many of you to incorrect conclusions. That happens to us on a regular basis. The Sermon on the Mount is very much a summary of what the Christian life looks like, but when many of us look at our own lives, do we see these things? Do you pray regularly? Do you regularly spend time in solidarity with the poor and the needy? Have you excised greed from every corner of your life? Have you investigated your heart and each of your thoughts that tend you toward anger or hate toward your neighbor? Do you bring your requests and your anxieties to the Lord, or do you fervently work yourself to the bone to push them out of your mind by force? Brothers and sisters, when we hear the Sermon on the Mount, we're often floored by its exactness, by its sharpness, by the fact that Jesus is placing before us an uncompromisingly moral and uncompromisingly loving standard. A lot of us read that and then feel some type of way. We feel like, well, I can't do all these things that Jesus is telling me to do. And so then that places us often in a place of insecurity. And it's from that insecurity that we often point that out to judgment of one another. Let's hear that text again. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now, this is a very commonly quoted and also commonly misinterpreted text. There are some people who quote this, and I mean, whenever you hear, don't judge me, or only God can judge me, all that kind of stuff comes from this kind of sentiment. But I also know some of you are like really eager to judge other people. So, we're gonna have to do some distinctions. The most important distinction in this verse is the distinction between righteous judgment and judgmentalism. Righteous judgment and judgmentalism. We're called to regularly do the former and never to fall into the latter, but we often fall into the latter. And here's how we do it. 3 ways that we end up being judgmental towards one another. Judgment beyond our scope, judgment beyond our context, and blind judgment. And the fact is that often, especially we Christians, judge in these ways. And so those outside the faith and within the faith often write us off as judgmental because often we are. Here's how that looks. So first, judgment beyond our scope. So when I was in college, I was obnoxious. I've told this story before, but my wife Desiree and I met in freshman year doing this focus theater program. And if you know anything about theater kids, we're kind of weird. I can say that because I'm one of them, but theater kids are weird. But one thing that I was absolutely sure of when I was a freshman in college was that all of my classmates were godless heathens. All of them. I'd gone through a pretty hardcore apologetics phase in high school, and I had unconsciously imbibed the idea that the Christian faith was something to argue people into. And so I showed up on campus at my secular private university ready to blow the minds of some pagans. Now, as you can probably guess, sprinkling your conversations with hellfire and brimstone is not super attractive. And it's really not helpful when that is also paired with a spiritual superiority. When it's paired with the idea that when you walk around with the idea that I, as opposed to you, God looked at me and said, "Ooh, I want that guy." Those other people, whatever. This Malcolm, oh yeah. This was me judging beyond my scope. This was my issue. We don't have the right to utter words of final condemnation against anyone. That's actually something that Jesus, should he choose to do so, has reserved that right for himself. Hear Jesus in John chapter 5, verses 21 and 22 and 23. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, so that all may honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. What Jesus is doing here is he's laying down the scope of his judgment. He's saying that Jesus is the one who gives life, and he is the only one who ultimately can judge it. We don't determine worth, which is often what our summary judgments of one another do. I determine whether you're worth my time and my energy. Or, perhaps more diabolically, some of us take it to the next level. Some of us think that we determine who's worth God's time and energy. That's what I mean when I say judging beyond our scope. God is the one who utters final judgment on any person, and God has already given us as much information as we need to properly judge one another. What is that data? It is that we are all created in the image of God. So then what does that mean? That means that we are called to treat every human being that we come into contact with as a human being to be loved, first and foremost. I mean, that's also the way that we want other people to treat us. Remember, the measure that you use will be measured out to you. Which means if you continually look out on the world in judgment and condemnation, you can expect that same eye to be turned back on you. It's better to just stay in your lane. Or, as I will repeat over the course of this sermon, it's like Jesus' voice is in the back of your head saying, mind your business. Don't judge beyond your scope. But second, don't judge outside of your context. So the best example of this is Paul in 1 Corinthians 5. So in this text, Paul is speaking to the Corinthian church because there's a man in their midst who's been having sex with his father's wife. And apparently the church was defending him. And so Paul utters a judgment in the name of Jesus. They excommunicate this man from their community, remove him from the community and from the benefits of the community. But it's what Paul says in the latter half of the chapter that's most interesting. Verses 9. He says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. That seems harsh, right? Well, so it might seem. Let's take a look at verses 12 and 13. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. That is, don't judge outside of your context. It's wild to me that there are some who would try to force particularly Christian standards of morality outside of church contexts. It means that those folks, Christian nationalists, are expecting those who are not indwelt by the Holy Spirit to act as though they are. That same delusion is present whenever any of us think that we can restrict all of our social circles to just people who adhere by a particular moral standard. Now, don't hear me say, now I want you to hear what I'm not saying. Who you hold company with is important. Paul will also say that bad company corrupts good morals. The company you keep is important. But Paul's point here is that hypocrisy is even worse than immorality. You can associate with the greedy people of the world. After all, they need to hear the good news of Christ. They need to see that the gospel calls them away from worship of mammon and toward worship of the one true God. But what Paul is saying is that if someone is unrepentantly greedy and they claim to be a Christian, don't associate with them. There are likely a few reasons for that. One is that it dilutes your witness, but the most important reason is that sin corrupts. It spreads. It's not content to remain in a particular individual. It wants power over that person as well as everybody that person comes into contact with. In this same chapter, Paul uses the yeast metaphor, saying in verse 6, don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? And brothers and sisters, if we have built spaces that are safe enough for us to confess our sins to one another, they've also got to be safe enough for us to hold one another accountable. That's what righteous judgment is. But we're not often content with that. Jesus is speaking against the fact that we just really like being up in each other's business, even when he's given us plenty of stuff to deal with ourselves. Even just in this community, we can spend a lot of time thinking about other communities, how they function, the cliques they might form, the things they do, the political parties they rally for, all those things. And Jesus is saying, look, mind your business. You've got plenty of stuff to deal with here. Don't judge outside of your context. But the last way that we often judge unrighteously, and the way that we can often be judgmental, is when we judge blindly. As people, we really like categories. It makes things so much easier. If I can just slot you into a particular category, it just saves me a lot of work. I don't have to think about your particular circumstances. I don't have to think about what you have or haven't been through. I don't even have to know you. I can just go on with my life, having placed you in a particular category. But brothers and sisters, this is a picture of what blind judgment is. And here are two categories that we often judge one another blindly: race and money. Race, let me put you up on game, as some say. Race is what one race scholar calls an ascriptive identity. An ascriptive identity. What does that mean? That means that it's an identity that is placed on you rather than one that you claim for yourself. Remember, historically, we're talking about a created category, a category that was created actually for a particular reason, and that reason is to justify structures of economic exploitation. If you want to know a little more about that, my book comes out in about 5.5 months. It's called The Anti-Greed Gospel: Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How the Church Can Create a New Way Forward. But race was not created as a category to describe people better. No, it was created as a category so that some could make a whole bunch of money and then justify it to themselves. And so fast forward a few hundreds of years, and we now find ourselves in a racialized society where race has an effect on folks' actual life outcomes, even though it doesn't reveal anything about that person besides the way that they look. For example, as you can tell, I'm black, but that very fact doesn't tell you anything about me. It doesn't tell you my preferences. It doesn't tell you my desires. It doesn't tell you my life experiences. It doesn't tell you what kind of music I like. For you to know any of that, you would actually have to interact with me. But race is one of these categories that we use in order to avoid that hard work. And that prejudice or prejudgment is an issue because it's blind. And yet, people are kept out of jobs, kept out of homes, have their schools defunded, are taxed more heavily, and face many other systemic barriers for the sake of a category that was created for the sake of domination and exploitation. Blind judgment is not just dangerous, it actively kills people. But this is also one of the methods that we use to treat the needy. When we see someone who's hungry or experiencing homelessness, or who's in some other position of need, for some of us, our first impulse is to ask, hey, why? What did they do? Why haven't they gotten their life together? That's an act of blind judgment. You've already made a determination on their life. You've already determined, especially based on the assumptions of our economy, that those who are in need are most likely in need because of their own failure. You've determined that there are things that they haven't tried, even when you know nothing about them. We default to judgment. What might it look like if we defaulted to mercy? The Sermon on the Mount is calling us to a different kind of judgment. The judgment that Jesus is warning against here is a kind of perverse curiosity, an asking questions just for the sake of asking questions or to build yourself up, an unloving inquiry, an unkind prying. But we're called instead, as one 16th century author says, to judge by the rule of love. We often default to judgment. Christ is calling us to default to mercy. It's one of the main points over and over in the Sermon on the Mount. Give to anyone who asks of you. Never seek revenge. Forgive, or you won't be forgiven. All of these things are Christ essentially reshaping our impulses. The impulses that we have to wrath, he's turning them to gentleness. The impulses that we have to hoard, he's saying, no, everything you have is to share. And he brings it home in chapter 7, verses 1 and 2 by getting to what is perhaps our greatest fear. Because he doesn't just say, don't judge other people because it's dumb, which it is, or don't judge other people because you don't know their situation, which you don't. What he says is, don't judge, or else you will be judged. That is, the same judgment that you mete out is going to be meted to you. The same measure that you use is going to be used for you. Because Jesus says this because he knows that judgmental people are the most insecure. That judgment often comes from a place of deep, deep insecurity. So then what comfort is there for judgmental people like us? What comfort is there for those of us who judge blindly, who judge outside of our context, who judge outside of our scope, or judge in these judgmental ways? Well, The answer is one word: grace. When we hear the words of the Sermon on the Mount and the very intense life that Christ is calling us to, we can take the easy way out and just say, well, God is a God of grace, and he understands that I can't do all this stuff. That would be the wrong way to understand it. Because God's grace is his gift to us that actually enables us to live in the way that he's called us to live. If you have repented of your sin and turned to Christ and placed your faith in him, Christ has given you this gift. When the Son of God took on flesh, died, was raised, and ascended, remember, he sent his Holy Spirit to dwell within you, an act of grace. He formed a people to walk alongside you, an act of grace. He gives us the sacraments. He gives us baptism, which washes us. He gives us the Lord's Supper, which nourishes us. He gives us this grace. God's grace is continually lavished on you, and yet you turn to your brother, sister, or neighbor in judgment? What sense does that make? If it's true that the measure that we mete out will be meted back to us, as much as that applies in condemnation, that also applies in grace. If it's true that God has shown great grace to you, and he continues to show great grace to you, why would you not extend that grace to your neighbor? Why would you not extend that grace to your brother? Why would you not extend that grace to your sister? This is what lies at the root of Christian nonviolence. Killing someone, regardless of what they've done, is the carrying out of a judgment, a summary judgment, particularly condemnation. Why can't the Christian kill? Because Christ has called us in this very sermon to love even our enemies, to extend to them the grace and the love that God has extended to us. And the last time I checked, it is not an expression of grace and love to someone to kill them. The last time I checked. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is not going to make proper sense if we just see it as a bunch of difficult commands that we just kind of work ourselves up to have the desire to grudgingly obey. No, we have to see the commands of Christ as themselves the outflow of God's grace, and the power to obey them as the outworking of that same grace. You see, when God's grace is understood as both the foundation and the fuel for our lives, only then will we be able to respond in the way that Christ commands in this verse. Only then will we be able to not be judgmental. And this is something that I had to learn. Because Desiree and I, as I said, we met freshman year when I was at my most graceless. I was judging outside of my scope. I was judging outside of my context. I was judging blindly, all of that. And so I awkwardly asked her out in between our freshman and sophomore year, and her thought process was like, do I want to have a boyfriend or not have a boyfriend? Malcolm's fine, cool. And so we started dating. And it took her probably about 6 to 9 months of us dating for her to actually like me. But I knew a few weeks into us dating that we were going to get married. Granted, I didn't tell her that because that would be weird. Like, don't do that. But here was the moment that I knew that was the case. We had just disagreed about something. I think it was something important. I can't even remember what the thing was. But I remember thinking in that moment, I really want to work this out with her. Now, that might not sound weird, but as I think back about it, that was weird for me because I was used to dismissing disagreement as foolish and dismissing people as well. Because why would you be dumb enough to disagree with me? Like, that doesn't make any sense. This is the way that I thought. And yet in that moment, I wanted to get to know this woman. I had a feeling that I was going to be getting to know her for the rest of my life. But that's the opposite of judgment. It's not just grace, it's an intimacy. See, brothers and sisters, it's hard to judge people when you're getting to know them. You're like really getting to know them. Like extending grace to them in every interaction with them. It means that you're seeing them as created in the image of God. You're seeing them as worth your time and your energy, because that's the only way that you can actually obey the first great commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The only way to do that, we're told, especially by John, is that by loving your neighbor as yourself, that's how you love the God who created you. The conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount begins in this way. Because the temptation for us, when we see especially high standards, the temptation is for us to apply those standards to everybody else and then have a lot of grace for ourselves. have a lot of grace for ourselves. I want us to think about grace a little bit differently. I want us to think about God's grace. That we can, by God's grace, hold ourselves accountable and hold one another accountable, knowing that God's grace actually gives us the power to actually live in that way. And when the world sees a community of grace, of fellowship, of solidarity, of love for Christ and love for the oppressed, then we can invite them into the kingdom of God, which is the only kingdom that is really worth being a citizen of. And so when you are tempted to judge outside of your scope, I want you to hear the words of Jesus saying, mind your business. When you're tempted to judge outside of your context, hear Jesus' words, mind your business. When you're tempted to judge blindly, hear Jesus' words in the back of your mind saying, what? Mind your business. Now, that could sound like, well, turn this into a navel-gazing moment where just focus on yourself. No. What is the business of the Christian? The business of the Christian is the business of the kingdom. The business of the kingdom is your care for your neighbor. The business of the kingdom is repentance of your sin. The business of the kingdom is you coming alongside the oppressed. That's the business that you ought to be minding. You're not somebody else's Holy Spirit. Let the Holy Spirit be that for them. You do what the Lord has called you to do, which is to love the people who you come into contact with. To bear witness to the good news that Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. Amen? Let's pray.